Welcome back to the Game Collection. I'm Super Derek, and last time I talked about Suikoden 4, and as we continue to make my way through this year's Summer of Suikoden, I wanted to talk about the game's follow-up and direct sequel, Suikoden Tactics. A little over 1 year after the release of Suikoden 4, Konami released a direct follow-up, Suikoden Tactics, for the PlayStation 2. However, in Japan, the game was simply known as Rhapsodia. Much like Suikoden 4, Tactics was written and designed by series veteran Junko Kawano. But this time, directing the game was longtime programmer and first-time director Osamu Komuta. Komuta would go on to direct Suikoden Tearcries for Nintendo DS and Genso Suikoden Tsumagareshi Yakunen no Toki on PlayStation Portable, the final Suikoden game that we never got. For an in-depth look into this game, definitely check out this amazing video by Jimmy Hoppa, which I'll be linking to at the end of this video. As the name would imply, Suikoden Tactics breaks the mold set by each of the Suikoden games that preceded it by borrowing from the likes of Shining Force and Fire Emblem and implementing a strategic battle system. The game is often called a prequel to Suikoden 4, but while the game does feature events that take place before the events of Suikoden 4, the majority of the game actually takes place after the events of 4. And in case you're wondering, based on my experience playing these games, I highly recommend playing through Suikoden 4 before Tactics and not the other way around. Especially because importing save data from Suikoden 4 unlocks certain powerful characters that can join your party later on. Suikoden Tactics picks up about 7 years before the events of Suikoden 4 as it follows the story of Kuro, a young boy who's traveling with his father and his father's companions. The group is apparently searching for something, which takes them across the paths of strange fish-like monsters that seem to be somehow connected. Just as soon as we start to uncover some answers, tragedy strikes as our hero bears witness to the pirate Brando as he acquires the cursed Rune of Punishment. This event would go on to set the events of Suiko 4 into motion. After this, the story jumps about 10 years into the future to find Kuro resuming the quest that he had once embarked upon all those years ago. And if that story hook sounded a little vague, unfortunately I had to keep it that way because of the way the story interconnects with Suikoden 4. The story of Suikoden Tactics overall feels a lot simpler than Suikoden games that preceded it, and it's far more objective-oriented from start to finish. This feels pretty refreshing right on the heels of the slow start found in Suikoden 4. Much of the story of Tactics feels like it was put together to address some of the criticisms levied against the game's older brother. For instance, far more time was devoted to development of many favorite characters found within Suikoden 4. However, the way certain objects from Suikoden 4 were retconned into having previously undescribed characteristics and capabilities didn't really sit well with me. These objects were effectively turned into this game's evil MacGuffins that needed to be destroyed. I understand this was done in an attempt to further link the two games together, but it feels like the idea was just kinda tacked on to justify the sequel, rather than something planned from the beginning. Due to the way the plot centers around these evil MacGuffins, I just wish that it felt like it fit better with the established lore of Suikoden 4. The story of Tactics, while simple, still managed to be an emotionally engaging one. The game has random moments of brutal tragedy that feel right at home in a Suikoden game. However, I found that the bright and cartoony visuals juxtaposed against these dark events felt rather jarring. And maybe that was the intended effect, I'm not sure. And I'm going to try to not spoil anything, but I need to tell you that the ending of the game glosses over one of the biggest bombshells in video game history that left me feeling a little uncomfortable with its implications. I didn't know whether to laugh or cringe at the revelation, neither of which were the intended reactions of the heartwarming conclusion the designers were probably aiming for, I'm sure. The majority of the gameplay found within Suikoden Tactics is your bog-standard turn-based strategy RPG that takes place on a tactical grid. Characters have different weapon types, stats, and ranges that give them different tactical uses within enemy engagements. However, the game features an interesting twist on terrain effects that you may have seen in previous strategy games. Instead of terrain affecting attack and defense stats, spaces can be colored by a rune affinity, which affects a lot of things. These affinities are either inherent in the terrain, such as puddles and rivers having water affinities by default, or they can be affected to take on that affinity using rune techniques. This means that the battlefield is constantly changing to one of the 5 possible rune affinities as opposing factions vie for the upper hand. I think if Nintendo suddenly decided to make a Splatoon strategy RPG, they might borrow some notes from Konami on how exactly to accomplish that. Rune affinity in battle makes a huge difference, more than you might be inclined to think at first. Being on a space that your character shares an affinity with will grant that character boosted attacks and defense stats, and ending a turn on that space will restore a good chunk of their hit points. Conversely, placing a character on a space they are weak to will result in weakened attacks and defenses, and ending a turn on a space will result in a loss of hit points. This can be a huge pain to manage, especially when your team consists of 12 or so characters with an even spread of elemental affinities across the lot of them. Luckily, special armors and accessories can be equipped which alter the wearer's affinity, which I abused the entire time, making rune management much easier. However, this is essentially placing all of your eggs into a single basket, where you just need to hope you're not facing a horde of enemies with rune-type advantage. Using this strategy is a double-edged sword that pays off about 80% of the time, give or take. In addition to these area effects, the game also features flanking bonuses, meaning attacking the enemies from the back or the side will deal more damage to that enemy, and surrounding the enemy with characters who have built up a rapport with one another increases the chance of a co-op follow-up attack or other assisting actions. Characters with more rapport can sometimes perform powerful combo attacks together. The combo attacks require specific character placement on your battlefield though, which makes using them something you have to pretty much plan on using from the start of battle. However, when used correctly, they are powerful enough to turn the tide of an arduous battle, making the payoff for your planning feel especially gratifying. Needless to say, all of these mechanics were quite a bit to take in as somewhat of a newcomer to the tactical strategy RPG genres, but I easily found myself absorbed into battles for hours, and I mean hours. Sometimes engagements would run from just 20 minutes to an hour or more toward the end of the game. These battles were engaging and quite challenging all the way to the end of the game, and these encounters could be extremely frustrating if the computer has it in for you that day. When non-essential characters fall in battle, there's about a 50-50 chance that they will either withdraw from battle or just die outright. Of course, I can't let that happen, so being forced to restart the battle after several minutes of engagement, or in one specific case while trying to finish off the final enemy on the map, proved to be especially maddening. Outside of battle though, the town menu system found in other similar titles makes up the majority of the game. After being spoiled by Shining Force, which featured actual towns to explore, I felt restricted, though not entirely surprised. Within these towns, you can do the usual stuff, upgrade equipment, talk to townsfolk, stumble upon side quests for recruiting more characters, and so on. The series staple of mass character recruitment returns to Suikoden Tactics, though you can't recruit as many as 108 this time around. Which is too bad since the battle system would have lent itself well to massive battles. Then again, waiting for turns to cycle through already takes a very long time, so maybe I should just be careful what I wish for. The world design of Suikoden Tactics jives well with that of Suikoden 4, though it's a shame you can't freely walk around towns and other locations that you discover. Sometimes battles take place within the streets of towns, and getting to see these places that you only hear described in Suikoden 4 was a nice treat. That said, the majority of the world you explore consists of the town menu system with different scenic underlays. Visually, Suikoden Tactics is kind of a mixed bag. The character portraits were pretty fantastic, and their user interface is solid. The cel-shaded visual aesthetic has aged well, as that tends to do. However, something about the character models feels a little too chunky. For instance, the blocky hands just look like blobs of color rather than hands because of the ambiguous shape and lack of detailed shading. The characters are big and bulky and designed to be easily identified from a bird's perspective, and designed to be low poly enough not to crash a PlayStation 2 with dozens of units on screen. Oh, and the battle environments are gorgeous. In the audio department, things get a bit better. The music of Suikoden Tactics may in fact be one of its greatest assets. It borrows a few familiar themes here and there, but is mostly comprised of original, beautiful compositions by Norikazu Miura. The voice acting within the game is overall pretty good too, but I do have to question some of the casting choices that were made. Specifically, while the voice of Kirill was well acted by the voice actress, I don't feel like her voice adequately portrayed that of a young man in his late teens or early 20s.
Yes?
Do you know anything about my mother? Who she was? What she was like?
Suikoden Tactics is a pretty interesting experiment for the Suikoden series. It has a great soundtrack, a pretty good battle system, and an alright plot. Only the problem is with the plot is that it just didn't feel like it was there from the beginning. It was just sort of tacked on to Suikoden 4. And also there's that ending that I'm still not really sure how I feel about it. But, you know, if you're just looking for a fun way to spend some time on your PlayStation 2 with a strategy RPG that's not gonna break the bank, then this could be the game for you. Now, next time I'm gonna be continuing my way through this year's Summer of Suikoden with the final console entry for Suikoden, talking about Suikoden 5, but we'll be talking about that next time on the Game Collection. A couple quick things before I go. I wanted to send a huge thank you to Brian Menzel for becoming a patron of mine over on Patreon.com. If you guys have any interest in supporting the show and helping support these weekly releases, please go over to Patreon.com and check it out. And I also wanted to send a huge thank you to Duhao for submitting this game to me for review. I would not have been able to review Suikoden Tactics without him because I was in a pretty tight financial situation at the time, but he came through, and I wanted to send him a special thank you. So thank you so much, Duhao, and I will see the rest of you guys next time. Take care, everyone.